Morning. Good afternoon already. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon with Professor Jonathan Jansen, who is, of course, no stranger to any of you here this afternoon. Is a man who does not like to be called controversial because he believes it's a duty. It is an ethos instilled in him to speak his mind and speak his mind for the greater good. But Professor Jonathan Jansen, thanks so much for joining us here and allowing me. This will be my fourth time that I'm talking to you about breaking bread, but there's so much that I would like to catch on. But firstly, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lester Kiewit. Thank you so much for joining us here. It is the fourth time I'm speaking to Professor Jonathan Jansen on this book, but I've known and read of you for many, many years now. I've read previous books. I actually listened to an interview this morning. It was an analysis of, I'm sure you know Charlie Rose, the American journalist, and was a critique on how he's a bad interviewer, but actually does the best interviews. And out of that, there is a little line that says many of his interviews are in fact authors. And now authors don't necessarily like to be interviewed because many of their day is spent in solitary writing behind a typewriter or behind a word processor. You, of course, have a dual role of not only being a prolific writer, but also being in front of a class as a lecturer. You've also have experience that we'll talk about as being a former lay preacher on a train. You're very much connected to the social aspects of connecting with people, but also that solitary perspective of being behind a word presser. But the conversation that we are going to be having here today is about the humble beginnings of Professor Jonathan Jansen, the importance of family, the academic breakthroughs, the career achievements, but also the core life lessons around humility, honesty, and fearlessness when it comes to in the face of much adversity. But Professor Jonathan Jansen, thank you so much again. I hope fourth time's a charm. The other interviews and other conversations have been quite noteworthy, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we must stop getting together like that. Die mense gaan praat.
So let me, before I get into the book, let me touch on the questions that I have not been able to ask you in the last 3 times that I have been engaging with you on this book. And it comes from a long-seated confession of mine. 10 years ago, I caught a virus, the woke mind virus, and I've not been able to shake it. I am, as you would say, woke. And it was really about a confession of my critique of you. And I remember a column that you once wrote about you being in Bloemfontein, and you went to a pizza shop. And you said you had wished that a Department of Home Affairs could be as efficient as a pizza shop. And where the critique comes in, a month later, that particular pizza franchise declares bankruptcy and closes. So my question to you is, has there ever been a column, a polemic, a lecture that you step back and you think, well, I may have regretted those particular words, just looking at your long career of writing?
Oh yeah, no, all the time. I mean, when you're a public persona and you're a columnist for 15 years, and the only reason I'm still a columnist, so they haven't fired me yet, is because you have to find every Thursday something new to say. And as a columnist, as opposed to being a professor who does research on complex things like curriculum theory, there I have to be very precise. When I am a columnist, I can be outrageous. I can work on the margins of, offense and saying what I see. But if you say to me, I wish I'd put it in the book, so this is a good time to say this. If there's one thing that few things irritate me, Stormers supporters irritate me, as a blue bull, and stuff like that. But few things irritate me in life. But the one thing that irritates me the most is somebody comes to say, Professor Jansen, I do not agree with everything you say, but how the hell is that even possible? I don't even agree with everything I say. It's the kind of nonsense, that when you grow up in South African society, you approach the world apologetically. You approach the world with, I don't agree with everything you say, but here you go. I change my mind all the time. I mean, in the nature of I actually did think Trump would lose, for example, just because I know Americans fairly well from 6 years there as a student and many more visiting. I really thought there's enough decent people, to prevent this maniac from becoming a president. I was wrong, and I underestimated my people. Turns out they're not my people, which is his biggest base, which is white evangelical Christians. I mean, this is why he won. But these are not, as Ed French said in the New York Times yesterday, these are not people who are the evangelical right, the religious right. They have, unmoored themselves from decency. So you can do anything. You can rape women, as he does. You can steal other people's money. Who cares, because of this Christian nationalist orientation. So my point is, I make mistakes all the time. When I do, and the context is right, I will say that, whether it's my children or whether it is my students. But you're not going to get anywhere as an academic, as a researcher, as a free thinker, if you don't ask difficult questions, if you don't take risks. The only thing I remember from primary school is getting a hiding for getting a math sum wrong. What kind of motivation is that to try again and so on? Yeah. So, yes.
So let's start about the early life of Professor Jonathan Jansen, who could have just have been Mr. Jonathan Jansen. You could have just been Jonathan, because you have held many different roles in life, from, as I mentioned, a lay pastor in a train. You may have even had aspirations of being a postal worker, but you've also sold fish and snook on Joe Marks Boulevard in Steenberg. Is there a point in life for you when you were absolutely certain this is what you want to do? Are you absolutely certain at the moment that you want to be a distinguished professor of education or a column writer for the last 15 years with the Sunday Times?
No, when you grow up on the Cape Flats, and particularly in the retreat in Steenberg, where we do you can only see as far as the horizon set for you, So I didn't know there was something called a university. I didn't know what people do there until I met a friend. I didn't know I could do stuff, like academics, because I was fairly average in primary school and fairly average in the first part of high school. Had a teacher not said to me, my Latin teacher, you pretend you know nothing, you just play soccer all day, but actually you have potential. I didn't know what the potential meant. There was no Google those days. I asked my mom, she said, potential means you don't have to play soccer for the rest of your life. So the point is that at each point in my life, somebody steps in and tells me what I can do, not what I can't do, because everything else told me what I can't do. So for me, just getting like a really good job at TEJ or at, I don't know if you still remember TEJ, or at the post office was going to be great, until these things happen, which I lay out in the book. Now, my friends say this is serendipity. My late mother would say this die hand van die Here, and they're both probably right. But I'm enormously grateful to be here and to have done a few things in my life. But as I say over and over again in the book, as you know, this is not something that you must be big-headed about. This is not something that I could do on my own. This is not something that, if I spoke at a youth camp, grade 12s at the school I work at in the mornings at the Rotary camp on, when was it, Friday night. And I said to these 110 matriculants, if only I can convince you that you're smart, that you can do stuff. But you see, if your father's in Pollsmoor and your mother's at Tikop, it's very difficult to see that. Now, where I was very lucky is having parents, very conservative, but having parents who gave us this bubble in which I could see all the violence, I could see all the dysfunction, but I could also see the beauty of their devotion.
I want to speak about Abraham and Sarah, but
Yeah.
also Paul Galanti,
Yes,
the
yes.
various people that create these shifts in your life. But talk to me a little bit about this speaking engagement you were just at,
Yeah.
and about the ambition of many a youngster in, for example, Crestway High, which you are still involved at now. A call for ambitions to be more than just modest. Finishing matric for you would have been absolutely fine, because at the time that was beyond what your parents had achieved. How do you how do you transfer a message now to say it's fine to finish matric and find some job that doesn't necessarily require so many technical or academic qualification? It's fine to want to work in a post office. It's fine to be in a managerial position at a retail store. But how do you involve also the conversation of ambition being more than what you just exposed to?
Okay, so that's a great question, because I obviously have to think about that a lot. You can't just speak hope into people, right? Into young people. You ought to do something more than that. So I hope, first of all, that they know that because I literally take them to my house where I grew up in, which is right next to the school. Used to be sand dunes there, you might remember. And they see, okay, this guy just got back from another award in the USA, but he lived a year, maybe I can do that too, which is true, of course. Then I say to the tourism teacher, put them all on the red bus. None of them have been on the red bus. Half of them have never been to the city of Cape Town, seriously, and they live in Lavendale and Capricorn and so on, all right? Next week, we're taking all of the grade 11s to, I took the grade 12s to Stellenbosch University where I work. Next week, the grade 11s are going to UWC. They've never been on a university campus, right? Therefore, they can't imagine what it means to study beyond grade 12. We bring in Fatima Jakut, who took one of the kids to China for science education. We bring in robotics people. What I'm trying to say is you need to broaden their curriculum beyond the ATPs and CAPs, and give them a sense of a world that they don't know about. When a student says to me the other day, I'll just give you one example. Professor, can you help me? I'm grade 12. All my life I've wanted to be a photographer. I said, my girl, are you free on Saturday? I call a friend who has a friend who's a top photographer in Cape Town. She said, bring her on Saturday morning. 6 o'clock, I take her to Sea Point. She shadows this person for the whole day. I've done that with a boy with Lansdowne Coachworks panel beating. He wanted to be a panel beater. In other words, open up their worlds, You see the middle classes like my children, white kids obviously forever. Your parent calls up Bob at Stutterford's, say, Bob, I'm sending my son to you. He's here at Bishop's. He's not very smart. My wife assures me it's my kid, but, can you sort him out? This is Cape Town language. Can you sort him out? And the kid gets sorted out. A kid in Khayelitsha, a kid in Langa, a kid in Manenberg doesn't have somebody to sort them out. And so the best thing you could do, and I'd say this to all of you here today, whatever your profession is or if you're retired, just speak to me, And if you can just take one kid for a day and say, come and sit here and see what I do. I'm a lawyer. Just do some photocopy. Have them have a sense of a bigger world, and that's how I do it. Obviously with all the teachers.
I reflect on my life, and as someone who has, my grandparents completely working class, my parents as teachers in the halfway mark of their lives, age 30, 40, becomes middle class. I am born fully middle class. My children will be second generation fully middle class, and I appreciate what levels of privilege they have. And it's the level of privilege simply to say, we're off this week. Let's just pop to the gardens and feed peanuts to squirrels, for example. So there's this wonderful teacher. He used to be at the Dana Primary. He's now a principal at the school, which I cannot recall. His name is Gino. And out of a class of 40, 45, Crystal High. And when he was at the Dana, he would, these are Tweedeland, Lotus River, 40, 45 children in a class, and occasionally you just take 5 of them. We're taking you to McDonald's. Next week or 2 weeks, taking 5 learners, just taking you to a cinema.
Yeah.
Next, just taking you to a spur, things like that. And that is, I think, incredibly important. But let's look at your life and senses of community. I am someone who's raised in a Christian community. I am may not be fully practicing, but I fully appreciate the importance of the church community. It's the first auntie and uncles that you know beyond your immediate family. But something I did not know before reading this book, that you actually grew up in an incredibly conservative and Christian household in terms of your parents, even with biblical names. The Plymouth Brethren is also something that I have read up after reading some of your books. But then also it leads you to a line of even lay preaching on trains. What role does the culture of Christianity and the culture of the Plymouth Brethren, where does that form a foundation for you?
Yeah, so you learn your basic values, in the home, first of all, and then because it was so tightly tied to the church with evangelical parents, both born-again parents, it was rough. It was really rough as a kid because, to this day, I don't drink, I don't smoke, and my kids are adopted. But 2 of those things are true, but... I can see not all of you got that joke. This is what happens when you do math lit. But but it was very tight, and I remember my mother didn't believe I should go to my matric ball, for example. So I was crying, of course, and I said, "Mom, why can't I go to my matric ball?" She said, "Well," and those of you who grew up in the Cape Flats, you would know, if your mother switches to Afrikaans, it's huge trouble, So we're English home, and suddenly she says to me, "Meng jou met die semels, dan eet die varkie op." I had no idea what that meant, but at the time. But so everything was, you couldn't go to Kwaibo Bioscope. You couldn't go. I couldn't do anything. 3 Arts opened up. You couldn't go to 3 Arts, even though Danny Bell was playing, or So in this very conservative environment, you were cut off from everything. You were taught that everybody's going to hell except you. The Catholics, the Anglicans are all going to hell. I apologize for that, by the way. The Muslims and the Hindus were already in hell. It's embarrassing to say that today, but that's how narrow-minded this was. But on the positive side, it taught me values that remain to this day that I taught my kids, like standing up if an older person comes into the room, greeting complete strangers as auntie and uncle, making sure other people eat before you do. This is like basic values, this thing of never thinking of yourself more highly than others. For that, I'm deeply grateful. That came through the church, and it's for everything I just told you, I can actually link it to a particular scripture. But I was also aware of the scriptures as I grew up that were misinterpreted. For example, I said this the other day at Bella Library. They almost threw me out. So my first names, of course, being evangelical parents, my parents named me Jonathan David, the eldest. So I was telling this crowd in Bella, by the way, this is true. Jonathan and David were the first gay couple in the Bible. So don't leave. So you should. So in 1 Samuel 13 verse 9, it says that the love of Jonathan for David was greater than the love of a man for a woman. Hello? Must I spell that out for you? So you become aware of the misinterpretation of Scripture. You become aware of the things you avoid, like the story of the Good Samaritan. It's actually a story about racial reconciliation, but I wasn't taught that because these were two different races, the Jews and the Samaritans, right? And then you also become aware of the deep racism in the church. The reason the English and the Irish flourished on the Cape Flats among so-called colored people is because they were verskrik. They love these big hats. They love the pomp of the English. They would never make that progress in Langa or in Nyanga, the two older townships, right? But they made it in Manenberg and so on. So as you became aware of that, the racism, the exclusivism, you know, I started to drift away from the church. But as I say in the book, the church never quite leaves you.
Yeah. Similar to me, I'm fully ensconced in the community of Christendom, but finding different ways to interpret that.
Right.
I may not be fully a practicing Lutheran, but I'm deeply committed to a community. But along the way, you discover the liberation theology of Gustavo Guterres, for example,
Exactly.
and that it molds you and
Yeah.
crafts you in a different way. But let's talk about the inspiration of singular people. You mentioned your father, you mentioned your mother, but let's talk about, you were at Steenberg High School. Steenberg High School is actually right next door to where my grandparents live.
Okay.
Tinderland Symphony Avenue. So
Yeah.
I'm very much familiar with the community there. And so there's a man called Paul Gelant who in fact tells you, but you're almost playing dumb, Jonathan. There is what we will call potential in you. How important is Paul Gelant? And he is that one person, and the importance of at least one person seeing a potential in someone that unlocks that seed in him. For our audience, who was Paul Gelant?
Yeah, so Paul Gelant lived in Steenberg as well, and he was my Latin teacher. And I mean, if you can think of a more boring subject than this old Roman, language, but he taught it with such a passion. He taught it with such excitement. I could see this man was into it's a fuck belief, and it inspired me greatly. But I really, there was nothing apart from him. Every other teacher just sort of existed, Like today, I think a lot of teachers have never. The reason they can't teach. I teach now as well, by the way. I teach natural science and then also biology, life science. And so there was nothing inspiring in the teaching. Nobody sort of took you out and took you to Kirstenbosch or Table Mountain or, the beach walk to see the kelp and how they make their own food through photosynthesis. Nobody did that, So you just sat in a class and everything was textbook and talk. So I was bored, And then Paul Gelant comes, teaches in an amazing way, pulls me out of a soccer match in the long break, the second break, and says, my boy, you have potential. You pretend you know nothing. That changed everything because nobody had told me that before. My Uncle Alfie would come to my dad's birthday on Christmas every day and say, Johnny boy, because they felt sorry for me, Hey, Johnny boy, you're just a few chips short of a Happy Meal, but we love you, And so I had these aunts and uncles that were quite pathetic, actually, But and so that changed, and I think from that day onwards, having always been in the middle of the class, the lower half, I never again came second in class, whether it is here or at Stanford or anywhere else. I never came second again, because one person. And so one of the reasons I think I became a teacher is because I know if I can influence, a bunch of kids every year to really believe that then you can change the world. And if I could do that with student teachers, 280 of them that I taught last year, just imagine, I've already seen it, by the way. I've already seen it. White kids going into Crestway to teach. I mean, this has never happened before. And you spread that influence across the country and across the world, my God. Can you imagine what influence we can have?
Yeah. Just on it was a Latin teacher.
Yeah.
You teach natural sciences, but you're also incredibly adept at the social sciences.
Yeah.
You took a jibe at Maths Lit earlier. Is there a space for a maths lit instead of a pure maths? Is there space for a life orientation at the sake of something else? Are subjects, and I use the example of Latin very loosely, but it is something that provides structure, rules. What's your thoughts on how you craft a curriculum that not only unlocks potential, but also sees students through a particular phase in their life?
Look, this is as true at schools as it is at universities. We are bullshitting these kids. The curriculum is completely out of date. It's rubbish, right? So now, if I had to redesign the curriculum for universities, for example, and for schools, the one thing I would make sure is that, and I've just been to the Silicon Valley again a week ago, let me tell you something. We are in deep trouble. Because if that kid cannot graduate knowing artificial intelligence, knowing the basics of robotics and machine learning, if that kid doesn't know that, not in a rhetorical way, but in the ways Fatima Jakut and others do it, we sunk. Because as my colleagues say to me, and they're right, AI won't take your job, but you won't have a job if you don't know AI, right? But what are we teaching these kids? Right? Total nonsense, you know. And so the question of math lit is sort of, I know where you're coming from, but it's sort of an irrelevant question in the sense that every child must learn math.
Yeah.
The problem is you can't fix it in grade 10. By grade 10, that kid is so messed up because the number concept wasn't taught well enough even before they got to school, right? That now you're forced to put them in math lit. I get that. But that's the wrong end of the stick. South Africans need to understand, if you're going to change the school system, you have to start in the foundation years, and even before that, you know. And we've run, you know, the problem is not a lack of reform, it's a lack of ideas. So let me just do a shout out for my favorite. I mentioned this at Harvard. I taught at Harvard last year, and I mentioned this, and suddenly, you know, they got money. They sent students all the way to Elsies River. Did you know that? Okay. Why to Elsies River? Because at Elsies River, there's a program called Math Moms, where they take unemployed mothers sitting at home in Elsies. Okay? Now, those of you folk who don't know where Elsies River is, this is where you go when you're feeling suicidal. You know, you go in the one side, there's no guarantee you're going to come out the other side. And it's not true, it's not true. That's a retreat where you grew up, you know. And they take these unemployed mothers and they say to them, we're going to help you with mathematics. So that, like with middle-class mothers and fathers, when your child comes home, you can help with the math homework. I still get goosebumps when I tell this story. Did you know that some of those math moms are now math teachers in the WCD? That's thinking out of, you may applaud. I think that's an amazing thing, you know. And all you needed was a white Afrikaans woman whose husband is a dominee up there in the northern suburbs, Sonia Sillier, and Sonia comes there and works amongst the people, you know. I said to her the other day, you're not actually white, you're black, you know, you're in a bigger sense, you know, your commitment is here. We need to think out of the box in how we go forward. But this notion of pushing every child, I'm engaged in that at the moment, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, just to get the kid over the line, you know, and finding all these tricks to get the kids to pass. That's not education, man.
I think there's a worrying statistic. If you speak to Professor Eric Atmore of the Centre for Early Childhood Development, I think the government subsidy for ECD per day for a 4 or 5-year-old is less than 100 rand. It's embarrassingly less than 100 rand. It costs, and I'm trying to grasp this figure, it's something like 450, 500 rand to maintain a prisoner in a correctional services facility. So where is the priority? Is the ECD with less than 100 rand subsidy a day, or to keep someone fully fed for 3 meals a day in a correctional services facility? But that said, let's move on to to your experience in academia, because I'm fascinated in how you use the scientific method in even discussions around social sciences. Actually, this week in preparing for this conversation, watched a lunchtime lecture that you gave at UCT, and your critique on the decolonialist movement, saying that it's far too often essentially a binary conversation. But after high school, after Steenberg, you go to the University of the Western Cape. Your experiences, they weren't all too happy, were they?
Oh no, I hated it every minute there. First of all, I didn't want to go to a place in which the government decided it was meant for me. Because, as you know, in the apartheid years, they decided, they gave you nicknames like colored. And then you had to go there. I absolutely hated that. You know, I didn't want to be amongst people who all thrived on the notion that they were colored, even the activists, you know. I wanted to be at a place that was relatively close to my home. You know, it's a short train ride, as you know, from Retreat to Rondebosch. But now I must take 4 modes of transport, including my thumb, to get to Belleville. I'm a science student, so it means 4 days out of 5, there's labs that end at 7, then there's no, 5, sorry, then there's no bus. So back home, and so I was tired all the time. I didn't have enough money all the time. And the university lecturers, particularly the chemistry guys, were particularly racist, Del Pia and Grobler. And I just gave up. I just walked out. I said, this is too hard, you know. And so when I became a university vice chancellor, and even when I was a dean, I said to myself, the one thing I will do for my students, the one thing, is to make sure that they never, whether they're white or black, have this horrific undergraduate experience, you know, and make sure that they enjoy it, make sure that they travel abroad in the universities, make sure that they, that my science students at Crestway can work with basic microscopy and see bugs under 40 magnification. I try to repair in the way I teach and lead around the stuff that I didn't have, you know, in my undergraduate years, and it's a commitment I still hold to.
I think that takes nicely into your experience as a vice chancellor at the University of the Free State, and that is when you largely become part of a public persona. You were not there at the time of the Rates Hostel incident, but that was very much something that after your inauguration you then have to deal with. All of a sudden, there's also this phenomena of a Julius Malema that then emerges in South African politics. What was that experience like, having to readjust a temperature at a university, academically, but also administratively, but all of a sudden you're also dealing what is essentially South African politics playing out at Free State?
Yeah, that was an absolutely wonderful time in my life. It was very tough. It was very difficult because, you know, at 9, 10 o'clock when everybody's gone home, you're alone with your thoughts and with what you did or didn't do. And so, again, drawing very deeply on my spiritual roots, you know, that helped me enormously. I remember one night at 10 o'clock when things were really bad on the Bloemfontein campus, I got a call from Vincent Mapai. Vincent Mapai is a very accomplished political scientist. Unfortunately, went to work for South African breweries, and it almost drove me to drink. But but he calls from Johannesburg at 10 o'clock at night, and he says to me, JJ, you know, I don't know how he knew what state I was in, and he says, JJ, I just want you to know that this too shall come to pass. I mean, I was so calm after that, you know. And a lot of people prayed, actually, and a lot of people were there to support you and so on and so forth. But it was very, very difficult at a personal level, right? But here's the thing, which I'm very grateful to my mother for, and it's still what I teach my children today, my 2 children. If you know something is right, you do it regardless of what people say, okay? And that is my commitment to education. That's my commitment to human relationships. That's my commitment to, I mean, one of the things that may I just slip this in here since I mentioned it to you very briefly? One of the things that I want to say to you as South Africans, or wherever you're from, that you really, really must watch out for. I work across social media. There is a rising tide, again, of xenophobic attitudes towards people from other African countries. You've got to speak out against that, okay? You saw that with the grilling of the CUT Vice-Chancellor the other day by this idiot, Ashley somebody from...
Ashley Souls of the
Souls from the
Patriotic
Patriotic Alliance. Why did you hire Zimbabwean or not this highly accomplished? He doesn't fucking know what highly accomplished is, right? Highly accomplished doesn't mean you have a PhD. Any idiot can get a PhD. Highly accomplished means there's a whole lot of things I want to see in you in order to lead the engineering faculty in this case, right? It's not just the fucking PhD. I was so angry about that. But we're not angry enough. And so when we burn a Mozambican alive in Alex, okay, we're all surprised. You know why you're surprised? Because you didn't stand up and speak out when this happens. A university is not a church or a mosque. A university is not a government department. A university is the one place in which you look for the best talent anywhere in the world. This is, sorry, just give me one moment. Please. This is where America is shooting itself in the foot. It has, Xavier?
Now I can hear you.
Okay. America has some of the greatest universities in the world, by far. Okay? Their schools are a mess, but the universities are absolutely top. Do you know how they became top? After the Second World War, when people fled persecution in Europe, and particularly because of National Socialism, they came to the US. Stanford University was an unknown place until the Second World War. And suddenly, who got the Nobel laureates? It was people who came there from Germany and Poland and all of these places. South African universities are great today, the top 7 or 8 of them. We discovered the Omicron variant, by the way, in Botswana and South Africa. You know why? Because you had a Tulio de Oliveira here, okay? You have a Slim Karim here. You have amazing scientists from all over the world. Cancer research on this continent is led by a guy from Zambia here at UCT. Don't be short-sighted, okay? A university must be open to talent from everywhere. And when people like Ashley somebody says that, you must understand it's Trumpism with a black face.
Is this also why you're phobic to forms of patriotism? You famously don't sing the national anthem at rugby games.
I don't sing it at all. I think it's a disgrace to sing the national anthem because it binds you to geographical borders. My commitment is not to geographical borders. Ons vir jou Suid-Afrika, fuck off. You know, I experience pain as a human being when a Jewish mother in Tel Aviv loses a child because of a Scud missile. I spend weekends crying when I think of 18,000 children in Gaza. 18,000 having their lives snuffed out because of this genocidal Israeli government of the moment, okay? And therefore, I cannot sing a national anthem that binds me to here when my commitment is to there. It's narrow-minded thinking. And so, yeah, no, I'm an internationalist, you know, I just don't know how you can love your country unless you love everyone else.
The idea around a symbol of a country, whether it be a flag or a national anthem or a leaping antelope over the real humanist feelings of caring and understanding the plight of someone in South Sudan or someone who is in a El Salvadorian jail at the moment who happens to be a migrant to the United States and then all of a sudden ends up in Central America.
I think Faf de Klerk got it right. Just put the flag on your underpants, you know.
But you also telling me about your experience, and we're on a conversation about the warning signs. You were recently in the United States. I have had friends who are in academia. I was relating you a conversation I had. He was about to go to a forum in Denver, Colorado. He's an American citizen, South African and American citizen. He was told by the organization, the event that he was going to, usually when you go and they send you your visa letter and say you are presenting at this conference, this is the title of your paper. What they're going to do is they're going to encode that title of your paper, so that if you get to border control at JFK to get a connecting flight to Denver, Colorado, the person at JFK Airport can't see, oh, you're providing a media critique on U.S. coverage of Gaza. So they're having to hide, to protect the academic integrity, to say that you can come to the United States, and that is absolutely bizarre.
It is bizarre, and I had to clean my own cell phone and my laptop when I went last week, or it's about 10 days ago, to Denver, actually, via Atlanta, because I just didn't feel like being held up, you know. I never thought, I mean, I learned the habits of democracy, obviously on the Cape Flats, but also in the US when I was a student there during the apartheid years. So it's weird for me to see a governor of Florida interfering in the appointment of a dean. Have you ever seen anything like it? At a public university. I never thought I'd see the day the University of Texas did exactly what you're saying in another context, which is to take out all references to race and gender and so on in their course titles for fear of losing federal funding or state level funding. The place has gone crazy, you know, and I just hope that, 3 years from now or 4 years, we go back to some normal.
Are we not seeing something similar? And I would argue on various sides of a political divide, whether it be a highly politicized students' movement who is calling for decolonial education, or whether it be a council of a university not wanting to make any formal commitments to disinvesting, for example, from Israeli companies out of fear of losing some sort of financial support, as we're seeing in the United States. It's happening on the student level, also happening on a funding level here in South Africa at the moment.
Let me just affirm the importance of student activism on our campuses. It is a very vital part of being a democracy. And whether you call your movement, decolonial X, Y, and Z, or whatever you call it, it is important that that space remain open, okay? And so on. I disagreed with a lot of the decolonial movement because I really thought they ran out of ideas. They subjected very complex, radical ideas to one thing. So feminism was out, okay? Anti-racial, racist developments were out. And there's a whole range of radical Marxian analysis of the economy were out. All of that now had to be subdued to one thing because they ran out of ideas. And by the way, decolonization doesn't fit in South Africa at all, because in this country, thank God, white people were made citizens. They weren't retained as colonial subjects, right? Unlike Mozambique, unlike other parts of the continent. So I never understood how this. I eventually wrote a book with a colleague who's late, unfortunately, as to why they chose that term. And it wasn't because of any deep thinking. So university is the one place where you need to think deeply before you open your mouth, right? And that worried me enormously. So the activism part is a separate issue. That's important for our democracy. It's the one place, a campus, where you can be ridiculous, okay? Even if that's not true anywhere else. But the threats to democracy are real. Most people get shocked when I tell them I was disinvited 3 times from South African universities in the past 2 years. UNISA, UCT, okay? They have academic freedom lecture, okay? And UKZN, Let me not say what I want to say about UCT but it's probably let me just say it. I just think it's got the largest concentration of neurotic people, anywhere on the continent. Everybody's sort of on there. They can't be normal. They don't know what it means to be normal, and so on. So we in trouble when we start disinviting. The guy who was responsible for drawing an image of the Prophet Muhammad, okay, I thought that was disgusting for him to do it. But I would defend his right to speak on any campus, because if you can't, okay, it's the end of the university. So you're quite right. We think as South Africans that we're immune, but it's only been 30 years. It's only been 30 years. And this stuff that I see, this authoritarianism, this clamping down on people for thinking differently from you, we're very vulnerable, unfortunately.
I'm going to be opening up to questions from the audience. If you mind, please raising your hand when you are ready to do so. In the meantime, while our audience formulates their questions, you stress in the book that you despise the term controversial. You say that you have something to say, and by damn, you're going to say it, and you're going to say it because you believe it the right thing to do. You also connect that with a sense of humility that's been instilled in you from a very young age, from your mothers and your family and your religious system. But you don't see yourself as being some sort of firebrand, controversial figure, eh?
Man, do you remember the apartheid years? Do you remember a chap called David Webster?
Yes.
Do you remember a chap called Stephen Biko, Panto Biko? Do you remember people who put their lives on the line? They died speaking the truth. Do you remember Zubaydah Jaffer, who was tortured here in Caledon Square police station with Rushka, a baby, inside of her, and they said to her, we'll torture you till this baby dies. I find it strange that this side of apartheid, when we were so courageous on that side, we shut up in the face of the most egregious. I mean, think of Life is a Domini. Where were the marches? When you took mentally ill patients out of the care of the state, gave it to unregistered service providers, and people were found dead with distended stomachs because they didn't eat. Did you see any protests on the streets? Did you see any outrage in the parliament? No. And so I find it, so the reason when I speak up against these things, I'm sort of saying, why are they calling me? Like, I'm not controversial. I'm doing what all of us did for many years. And so the question then is, of course, why are people so quiet? And I tell you why people are so quiet. The first reason people are quiet is because you can make, as an academic, do you know that when I submit things to government, I just submitted something now for the attention of government. I won't tell you how we submitted it. They had to take my name out, even though I wrote the thing. Okay, they had to take my name out just so that government would make an announcement on it. Okay? Now, I don't mind that, so long as the idea goes forward. My point simply is you can make a lot of money as a consultant for government. You can get the order of what Boabab or something like that. And if those things matter to you, you're back. You're right? Even in the face of atrocity. And so I think the only reason I stand out is because everybody else is so bloody scared to open their mouth.
I hope no one is scared to open up their mouths right now. Please put up your hands up if you have a question. Sir.
I don't know if it's a question.
Sorry, ma'am, you had the cap on.
I can be a woman or a man. Is it on? Thank you. I'm glad you're looking at me because I doubted if you the real Jonathan Jansen. Anyway, I hope you don't mind me calling you David. The other David that I knew was from Sea Point. He was a white, well, I don't like to call people black and white because that doesn't really exist. That is so last century. But anyway, he was a priest, Anglican minister at, I think, St. Saviour's in Claremont. So it's very funny for me, David. My question is, or my comment to your views that you expressed when you said whether they're black or whether they're white. I cannot believe that you still see people in terms of color. So, David, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm not so sure why you made the shift to David. It doesn't bother me at all. But but let me just say this. I was not influenced as a UWC student by the Congress movement at all. A lot of people of my generation came under the influence of the Black Consciousness movement. And here in Cape Town, under the influence of the New Unity movement. So the way in which I use black and white has got nothing to do with pigmentation. It's got nothing to do with race. It has something to do with the particular political and economic position of people in the society. I always say to my students when we have these debates, just read one book in your life, and if you're South African, and it will change your way of thinking. And I'm giving this to you as well. It's going very cheaply on Amazon at the moment. It's called How the Irish Became White. Okay? So white isn't used here in the sense of the lack of melanin. It's used here in relation to privilege.
So in the white shirt, the red shirt at the back. So, after you, man. Okay.
Sê weer? Ek was op Vrystaat van 2009 tot 2016, min of meer. Reg. Ja, die ek kan sien, ja, dit wys. Only a Koffsie knows the feeling. That's sort of the local experience.
So,
Good afternoon, Professor and Chairperson. Is freedom compatible with democracy?
Is freedom compatible with democracy? I think so. Obviously, I'm thinking now of 3 or 4 theorists who've engaged that question. I mean, since the days, as you know, of the Greek philosophers. But let me ask you this. Why do you ask that question?
Why do you ask me such a difficult question? I thought that you would have the answer.
I need to know your angle on the question because I can keep you busy for a few hours.
We live in South Africa and we are called a democracy.
Yeah, right.
As I feel like my individual freedom is impinged upon, and my inability to speak out is based on my fear of consequences.
Right.
So I'm wondering whether, am I living in a democracy or am I really free to say what I need to say? And this is what I'm struggling with on a personal level.
let me add, sure. There have been, over the last few years, several Afrobarometer surveys, and from going just below 50 to in the last few years above 50, that most South Africans surveyed would appreciate some form of benign dictatorship if they were service delivery, and they would rather forego elections than some sort of benign dictator in this country.
Yeah, okay, it's slightly different nuances on the same question, but let me start with how I hear you say. So I think we mustn't think of democracy as an event. If you think that we got democracy in 1994, then you're not paying attention, right? So you need to think of democracy as a process in which you have to fight long and hard, sometimes for centuries, in order to establish what John Samuel calls the habits of democracy. Now, we don't have the habits of democracy. If you look at our parliament and the bus stops you used to see for years now, that's not democracy. Democracy isn't the right to vote. Democracy is a practice, right? And it's a practice that you must fight for and establish over many years. Americans thought they had a democracy until January the 6th, and then they realized they don't, right? And so they consciously, in their constitution, talks about a more perfect union, something to strive for. I think we underestimate. You've had 3.5 centuries of colonialism and then formally apartheid. Do you really think you're going to wipe that out in 30 years? Just don't be ridiculous. If you just go down the main road here, from Jan van Riebeeck, all the way down to Fischhoek. We did a study of all the white schools there, okay? I'm telling you, for a whole lot of its schools, it looks exactly as it looked in the 1990. So democracy is something you must fight for. Democracy is something that you must practice in your home. Democracy is something that you must stand up for because it's constantly under threat, right? But we don't have a democratic practice. You know, unfortunately, I only have one life, you know, but South African soldiers died in the Eastern Congo. I didn't see any penetrating journalism on what the hell just happened to our people. Nothing. Okay? In a democracy, that would have been non-stop news for 3 months on end. So I'm looking to my right here, physically, not ideologically, you know. Where are our newsmen and women, okay, raising issues? So that's what I mean by democracy, sir. A practice that must be fought for, and God knows we're just getting started.
Papa?
Thank you, Lester, and thank you, Professor, for a very interesting discussion. You mentioned your experience teaching in the United States and studying there. And Lester's comment about, well, we'll just have to wait 4 years. I want to ask you to comment on whether this moment in American history is not a complete turning point, whether we're not seeing the rise of an authoritarianism that's going to affect the whole world. In terms of their standpoint on almost everything from, you know, Palestine to Ukraine. Are we not at quite a dangerous moment in world history?
So, hi, Papa, good to see you. I asked that question of my colleagues who are political scientists and students of scholars of democracy, like Larry Diamond, a few months ago. And they insisted this is not an inflection point. In other words, this is not a turning towards. So then what is going on at the moment? So this is my thinking, as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about this, particularly in the context of universities. I think what you're seeing at the moment is temporary in the sense that Americans are, and I know this, amongst the most generous people anywhere in the world. I can guarantee you that. But at the same time, they are among the most selfish people in the world when it comes to their own pockets, right? And they were willing to give up on the fact that this man was a rapist, that this man was a convicted felon, that this man had, bankrupted his own companies, with his father's money. They were prepared to look away from this man's, what's his name, because of their sense of the price of eggs, which became, as you know, sort of a metaphor for the cost of living. So that selfishness has now hit them in the face. And if you look at every major poll over the past week, every major poll says that on both immigration and the economy, the guy's underwater, right? And this is where my favorite writer for The Atlantic, I think, gets it right when he says you have to understand the basic hydraulics of the American two-party system. That he is in now, he will be out in 4 years' time. And by the way, you'll see this big shift, I believe, with the midterms 2 years from now, because at the moment the Republicans hold the Senate and the House and, of course, the White House. So I think this will change, okay? But your underlying point, which I just want to emphasize, America is not except. There's only 2 countries in the world that think they're exceptional, okay? That God planted them there. It's America and us, okay? But what's happening in America is happening in Hungary. What's happening in Hungary is happening in parts of Germany. What's happening in Germany is happening in parts of France, as you know, with Marine Le Pen and that movement. Brexit, all of these were, in my view, a response to a world that is changing, particularly around migration, okay? So America's not except Trump is an uninteresting character.
I just find, he reminds me so much, sorry, I have to say this. He reminds me so much of a Lavendale gangster. No, seriously. If you grew up among gangsters, you know what I mean. You got power. The only way you can subdue somebody else is through brute force, okay? And then you get people who must swear loyalty to you, okay? Have you seen his cabinet meetings? Before they start the cabinet meeting, every cabinet member has to say, that is great, with a red cap in front of him. And somebody said the other day, even Kim Jong-il would have been embarrassed by this display of fealty. So I do think, maybe I do hope, that this is not an inflection point and that things will get back. But the damage done is permanent. It's not like you can just spring back like an elastic thing. But my concern is less about America. My concern is more about us. Because we're looking and sort of thinking, we're okay. We're not okay. We are susceptible to the same global forces that hates foreigners, that takes care of yourself first,
and that looks for scapegoats. Can I just tell you what I put on X before Elon Musk, the Pretoria boy, takes me off? I put on X this morning, if you can't find a job in South Africa, you as a South African, blame a foreigner. If you're colored, blame an African. If you're Christian, blame a Muslim. If you're white, blame the blacks and you get a ticket to America.
Professor, with just a few moments left, may I just ask you to wrap up this conversation with this parting shot? And you spoke about the South African neuroses. Funny enough, I never saw, I see neuroses almost a little bit comical, maybe we are, but there's this quote that's attributed to Smuts, who says that in South Africa, the best never happens. In South Africa, the worst never happens. It's essentially, we're always on some form of precipice. We're always teetering and looking down over into the chasm, and then something by miracle manages to just yank us back, just ever so slightly. In your parting shot this afternoon, what is it about the South African indomitable spirit, exceptional as we are? What is it that always seems to just pull us back from the precipice?
I think what really keeps us from going over the edge is not the government. I work in all 9 provinces, mainly with schools and universities, and I can tell you now, there are many more good people in this country than there are corrupt people. There are people who get up every single morning just to make this country work, okay? And I see that every single day, okay? And so my faith is not in the structures of power. My faith is in this auntie in Belhar the other day who said out of her own pocket, and she's not rich, she makes food for kids every day. Now multiply that 1 million times across the 9 provinces. And you'll see that what holds us together are these many, many people. I get a platform with you on this stage. I wish every South African who does something good gets a platform. I don't need a platform. And so I thank you, I thank my parents, I thank you all, Lutheran, community, among many others, for giving us a sense of hope. And that's what keeps us from going over the edge, I believe.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Jansen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Remember, books are available right to the left of the entrance, and I'm sure Professor Jonathan won't mind signing a book or two, but thank you so much.